Thank you, everyone. Welcome. I'm Brittany Baker, Maryland Director of the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, and I'm excited to have you today. This is a really important dialogue, very timely. And tonight we're going to be talking about historical redlining and how that has affected current climate vulnerability and current climate impacts. What I'm most excited about for the event tonight is building a bridge. We know we have lots of environmentalists on the call. We also have lots of individuals all across the state who care a lot about the legislative Black Caucus of Maryland and are getting to know the topic of climate change. So welcome to everyone. Feel free to ask questions in the chat anytime, and we'll address them when we can. Um, but we will not have a long question and answer session at the end. So definitely put your questions in the chat so that we can address them. So to get us started tonight, I'm going to introduce the distinguished chair of the Legislative Black Caucus of Maryland, Delegate Janelle Wilkins from District 20. Delegate Wilkins proudly represents the 20th Legislative District in Maryland. She is born in Kingston, Jamaica, and is dedicated to policy change that makes a difference in people's lives. Delegate Wilkins is the vice chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, where she also chairs the subcommittee on election law, leading the House in passing election policy and expanding voter access, including passing Maryland's permanent mail-in ballot list, voting access for incarcerated individuals, and expansion of early voting. Delegate Wilkins is the chair of the Legislative Black Caucus of Maryland, the largest Black caucus in the nation. She previously served as parliamentarian of the Maryland House of Delegates, ensuring efficient, fair, and orderly procedures as the House conducted the business of the state. She has championed and successfully passed legislation dealing with racial profiling and justice reform, maternal health, and increasing educational outcomes for all students. Delegate Wilkins, the chair is all yours.
Thank you so much, Brittany, and thank you so much to our partners at Chesapeake Climate Action Network for helping to pull us all together. This is such a necessary conversation. Again, I'm Delegate Janelle Wilkins, and I represent District 20 in the House of Delegates. I am the chair of the Legislative Black Caucus of Maryland, and it is an honor to share this space with some of the foremost leaders and innovators in environmental justice tonight as we discuss topics from redlining to the Renew Act and how we advance reparative justice in policy and in practice together. We are grateful to partner with the Chesapeake Climate Action Network in this event and all of our environmental partners who helped make this happen, including the Chisholm Legacy Project, Progressive Maryland, Third Act Maryland, Out for Justice, Nature Forward, the Center for Engagement, Environmental Justice and Health, No Boundaries Coalition, Central West Baltimore, the Climate Justice Wing, Young, Gifted, and Green, Food and Water Watch, Sierra Club, the South County Environmental Justice Coalition, the League of Conservation Voters Education Fund, and other groups. It is not every day that this constellation of leaders and advocates and organizations come together. So this is a really important evening, and this is what coalition building truly looks like and how we make progress. For background, the Legislative Black Caucus of Maryland is the largest Black caucus in the country. We have 67 Black legislators in the House and the Senate, and we are the voice for Black Maryland in Annapolis. For the last 55 years, the Legislative Black Caucus of Maryland has stood together to advocate for justice and equity in Maryland. And our core policy areas are health and the environment, housing, building Black wealth, justice and public safety, as well as education. And in all of those areas, we work to transform the lives of Black Marylanders. One thing that I think is very important to ground ourselves in as we continue this conversation is that the inequities we see today, whether it's the wealth and income gap whether it's health disparities or environmental disparities, they're not by chance. These are not issues that just popped up. It's not because Black communities aren't working harder or advocating for themselves. These are direct results of generations and decades of harmful policies and choices. And we have to address these issues at the root in order to make systemic change. And that's why the Legislative Black Caucus of Maryland and all of these groups came together, because it's not enough for us to recognize and see the inequities and injustice. We have to work to repair and fix these harms. So we'll hear about more today: redlining laws, which originated in Maryland, and other laws rooted in racism, and how that has a direct impact on health and climate of Black Marylanders today. That's also why the Legislative Black Caucus of Maryland this year passed the first ever action in our entire state on reparations, the Maryland Reparations Commission, so that we can look at the full suite of systemic challenges, whether it's climate and the environment, or racial wealth inequities or housing inequities, and work to create a plan for our state to address and repair these harms. The Legislative Black Caucus of Maryland also supported the Renew Act and voted to support that legislation as a caucus. So we're excited to talk about that tonight as well. So finally, as we focus on climate, I do want to take a moment to lift up everyone in my home country, my country of birth, Jamaica, who is impacted by Hurricane Melissa. We know that the catastrophic events that we are seeing that impact communities globally, with often a disproportionate impact on Black communities, is rooted in climate change. And climate scientists are ringing the alarm around Hurricane Melissa. And we want to make sure that on behalf of all of us that are convening this event here, that we also make that connection, and that our hearts and our support go out to Jamaica as well. So on behalf of the Legislative Black Caucus of Maryland, thank you for attending this impactful discussion, and it is now my pleasure to turn this call back over to Brittany Baker.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. So I'll just jump in with some slides because I will lay the groundwork for us tonight with some key definitions and explanations. And then we'll jump right into the conversation because I know that's what I'm most excited about tonight. So for my panelists, feel free to stay on camera, but also if you need a sip of water, now is a great time. This presentation will be about 15 minutes, and then we'll dive right into our discussion questions. So again, I'm Brittany Baker from the Chesapeake Climate Action Network. I'm the Maryland director. And Chesapeake Climate Action Network is a group that was started in 2003 by our executive director, Mike Tidwell. And we focus on people first climate action because we believe it takes grassroots power to move forward policy. And so Chair Wilkins already introduced our co-sponsors for the night. And I just want to send another thank you specifically from CCAN. So to dive right in, we're talking tonight about historical redlining and current climate impacts. So redlining, for those of us who aren't as familiar with the topic, began around the 1930s. And it was a situation where the federal government, not state governments, not biased institutions, not community groups who wanted to codify some racism, but actually the federal government created security maps to assess mortgage risk primarily. In drafting the map, cartographers used the colors red, yellow, and blue. Well, red, yellow, blue, and green to grade neighborhoods based on potential risk factors, including what type of people live there, if there was pollution in the area, what type of infrastructure was in the area. And so areas shown in red are the fourth grade areas or D areas, and they were considered the highest risk areas. But what's really interesting when we look at this map from 1937 of Baltimore, I mean, it's easy to focus in on the red areas, but look at the yellow, look at the blue. When you really focus in, you see that the green areas that are identified as favorable are so few and far between and concentrated right there in the middle of the city. Um, So they characterize risk factors in the area, such as detrimental influences, undesirable population or infiltration of it, low percentage of home ownership, very poor maintenance, and vandalism. And what we see is that a lot of the ways that they characterize those areas, because this characterization was then given the opportunity to proliferate because they added onto the layers, denying mortgages, preventing people from getting insurance, preventing people from having the best schools. And so now some of the original characteristics of the red line area still remained. And these impacts run the gamut from lack of educational opportunities, public health impacts such as asthma rates, diabetes, wealth attainment, and various features of the community that make them not fun to live in and really affect everyone's quality of life and also their length of life. So, what we're seeing now, to give first a definition, climate change, for those of us who are less familiar, is the reality that some of the human activities that we've been perpetuating in the last 100 years, whether that is the use of fossil fuels such as gas and coal, or whether that is deforestation and other activities that increase the amount of certain greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, such as methane that's produced when you throw away food scraps into a landfill. All of those factors are starting to change our climate. And we're seeing this on a global scale and regional scale because even though the global situation is a mean temperature that's increased, when it comes to the regional situation, the impacts can look a variety of ways. And so some of climate change impacts are very direct. So, direct impacts on weather, direct impacts on rain, direct impacts on the amount of heat that we're seeing in summers. And there are some impacts that are more indirect. So we have greater incidence in mold in households and communities due to the more intense rain events. Or we have loss of productivity in terms of summer work because of more intense and hotter summers. But there are even a whole list of lesser known effects that some of you on the call who are my colleagues in the policy space know about. But the public doesn't often connect to climate change. And some of those include higher utility costs due to utility companies needing to upgrade their infrastructure because increased extreme weather events, but also the down rating of like gas, the gas commodity, but also higher insurance premiums, greater incidences of vector-borne diseases like Lyme and malaria. We're starting to see those in places that we haven't seen them before because the animals that carry this diseases like mosquitoes and ticks can survive longer in the year and in new places. Increased stress on pregnant populations, landslides, exacerbation of environmental justice issues. Because, of course, if your community is already polluted, then you're also going to experience greater impacts when there's more flooding. And then, last but not least, the economic impacts of building resilience. And that's really key, especially when we talk about the Renew Act that Chair Wilkins referred to. In order to build resilience against these climate change impacts, it really is an economic cost. But also, when extreme weather events happen, the costs of disasters are rising year by year. So, when it comes to redlining and its effects on climate change, there are a lot of studies that have well established that these historical patterns of discrimination are putting Black and Brown communities at the forefront of the climate change impacts and the extreme weather events. And on the screen, you have three examples of studies that have linked these two crises, and I'll put those in the chat a little bit later. But some of the, if we were to focus in on the issue, some of the ways that we experience the impact and the connection of redlining and climate change are, for example, impermeable surfaces. So we know that in communities that were historically redlined, they have a greater incidence of impermeable surfaces. So that's surfaces where when it rains, the instead of the water absorbing into the ground or absorbing into trees, there's a lot more runoff. There's very little infiltration, and that causes very bad impacts for the community where that occurs. One of those impacts is flash flooding. And so what you see on the slide is a study that was done by Redfin, because at this point, even, the realty companies are catching on to this fact that the impacts and connection between redlining and climate change are materially affecting populations and people and have really material wealth implications. And so this 2021 study by Redfin analyzed 38 metro areas and determined that 25% more flooding is happening in communities that were previously redlined than communities that were not previously redlined. And this is jeopardizing over $107 billion worth of homes. And Chicago was a particularly acute example of this. And you can see them there, the fourth line on the graph, because Chicago was built on a swamp and they have significantly more homes at risk of flooding than previously thought. And the reason they say than previously thought is because the way people experience this flooding oftentimes in Chicago is by having a flooded basement. And nearly 13% of the city's more than 600,000 properties are estimated to face a 100-year flood risk. And so about 90% of flood damage insurance payments in Chicago are made to households in communities of color, according to a 2019 study, which was referenced in the Redfin study. But something else that's interesting, and you see a different side of this in some of our coastal cities in the United States, and that's a case where homes that were not in the red line zones are now getting more flooded. And that really speaks to wealth attainment. And so in cities like Virginia Beach, Miami, and Hartford, Connecticut, a lot of the red line areas are away from the coast. They're lower cost homes in areas that are less desirable. And so now in those communities where along the coast or next to the beach, they're getting more of that flooding, not so much of the flooding related to heavy rains like we're seeing in cities, but more of that coastal flooding. And another impact that we all this is the one I find people are most familiar with, and that's extreme heat because of the urban heat island effect. And so continuing to pull that thread of impermeable surfaces, when you live in a suburb or a city that has a lot of pavement, whether that's sidewalks and parking lots and roads, and there's not so much tree canopy and there's a lack of green space, it really creates the situation where heat is intensified in the area. And you can see from this chart, which is from an NPR document that was published in 2020, there's a scale of neighborhood rating A, B, C, D, and average temperature. And you see the D areas, which were referring back to the charts that we saw earlier in the slides, those are the red line communities. And you see those communities can be up to 6 degrees hotter and really more. I mean, if you take the full scope, we're talking about 16 degrees hotter than some of the cooler areas that have better infrastructure for homes and in the communities, more green space, more trees, more space between the houses. And we know that these heat impacts are very significant, especially because, like we stated earlier, in zones where people at least perceive that there's a high crime rate, there's a reluctance to open windows, there's a reluctance to open the doors. People might be energy burdened. And so then people are not getting cooled off the way that they should. And it really creates the situation where you'll have intensified heat illness and more heat deaths. And so, again, I told you I would just give you the top lines tonight, and we're going to jump in with our panelists. But this is the last thing I really want to say. So, we know that non-red line communities are experiencing impacts from climate change as well. Right here, you see a picture in Tacoma Park, where I live, with some flooding we experienced over the summer, where our local creek rose 10 feet in 30 minutes. It was really ridiculous. Some people had to be saved from the parkway that goes parallel to the creek. And I don't want to ignore that these impacts are happening in other places. But the thing about impacts that are happening in other places is sometimes they already have resilience infrastructure. Like in Tacoma Park, we already closed down that road frequently. We have really good alert systems so people know to go back to their homes and to avoid that specific creek when it's getting flooded. And Howard County, for example, their downtown floods, Ellicott City Historical District floods as well, but they already are in the process of building a tunnel to alleviate that flooding. And so the intensification of climate change impacts in redline communities, of course, they're more intense, but sometimes it's the situation that the stories aren't told, the stories aren't uplifted, and the communities aren't being supported. And that's equally making these impacts more acute on the community. So the last thing I'll say is that as we all walk forward in the escalating climate crisis, and we hope to bring resilience into communities, whether it's here in Maryland or all across the globe, what we have to remember is that there's an intersection between climate justice, social justice, and environmental justice. But writing policy, doing work that meets that intersection is not guaranteed, because you can move forward in environmental justice and not achieve climate justice. You can achieve some social justice and never achieve climate justice. And so it takes all of us to really meet in the middle and make sure all of these important things are moved forward. And the last thing I'll provide for you is a reading recommendation on this topic by a champion of environmental justice, the Dr. Robert Bullard and Beverly Wright. It's a very great read, and I recommend it to everyone. So with that, back to our panelists. I'm really excited to dig into the conversation tonight. And I'll start off by introducing everyone. So I'll start with Jackie Patterson. So glad to have you tonight. Thank you for joining. Jackie Patterson is the founder and executive director of the Chisholm Legacy Project, a research hub for Black frontline climate justice leadership. She has worked on gender justice, racial justice, economic justice, and environmental and climate justice with organizations including the Center on Budget Policy Priorities, IMA World Health, United for a Fair Economy, ActionAid, Health Gap, and the organization she co-founded, Women of Color United. Before founding the Chisholm Legacy Project, Jackie Patterson served for 11 years as the Senior Director of Environmental and Climate Justice at the NAACP. She currently serves on the Board of Directors for the Institute of the Black World, National Black Workers Center Project, the Bill Anderson Fund, Ceres, and the Emerald Cities Collaborative, as well as advisory boards for the Center for Earth Ethics, the High Fund for Gender and Climate Justice, Frontline Justice Fund, the Just Solutions Collective, and the Environmental Justice Movement Fellowship. And she also serves on the governance assemblies for Collectrify Fund and Mosaic Momentum Fund. Our next panelist I would like to introduce is Dr. Sakobi Wilson. Dr. Wilson is the founder and director of the Center for Engagement, Environmental Justice, and Health Empowering Communities, also known as SIEGE Inc. Dr. Wilson is a nationally renowned thought leader and scientist in the environmental justice sphere with experience spanning more than 25 years in the areas of exposure science, environmental justice, environmental health disparities, community engaged research, including community-based participatory research, community science, and community-owned and managed research, and air quality studies, including building hyperlocal air quality monitoring networks, geographic information systems, including developing environmental justice screening and mapping tools, built environment, climate change, industrial animal production, climate change, community resilience, and sustainability. Then I'll also introduce Latricia Adams. Latricia Adams, a native of Memphis, Tennessee, is the founder and CEO of Young, Gifted, and Green, an organization focused on environmental justice and civil rights. Miss Adams is a proud HBCU graduate from Tennessee State University and a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. Skiwi Soror. Oh, Chair Wilkins is a soror as well. She was the youngest African American woman and only K-12 educator appointed to the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council and has held various leadership roles in the community and environmental organizations. With a background in K-12 education, Latricia has received numerous accolades for her environmental advocacy work. And our last panelist who may join us at some point is Senator Benjamin Brooks. When he joins, I'll read his bio as well. So let's dive in and start off with one of the most important questions, which is, how does your work intersect with the topic tonight? Anyone feel free to go first.
I can start. So with Young Gifted and Green, apparently like with the name, we do a lot of work to engage young people into the environmental justice movement. Once upon a time, we used to be called Black Millennials for Flint, because our work started nearly a decade ago in the wake of the Flint water crisis. But millennials are not the babies of the bunch anymore. But we still have a profound focus on making sure that our young people are included in this movement and that we build a pipeline. In addition to that, we also focus significantly on shared governance as it relates to community voice, from a policy perspective as well as rulemaking. And then we also focus significantly on all implications of lead. We talked about Flint. We have a special niche as it relates to lead in all of its forms, including how lead exposure is exacerbated by climate change. And then the last thing, I'm going to always be a teacher for life. So we also work very diligently to focus on community education as it relates to environmental issues so that it's tangible and accessible, regardless to what type of stakeholder you may be in the process.
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick. Can y'all hear me all right? 'Cause I'm on my phone. Yeah, so great theme of the day. I would say, our work with Siege Inc. and also I'm a professor at University of Maryland College Park. I direct the EJ lab there. Segregation is really important to understand why we have environmental justice and equities in planning, zone, and development drive environmental justice. So as it was stated, it's called planning. In the words of my frat brother, who's also, we're alphas, Carlton Elliott, it's called planning, not accident, right? So you look at a project in Baltimore called the Baltimore Code Red Project. I consulted on that project. It was done by students from the College of Journalism at University of Maryland. So you see how climate change impacts folks differently, right? You may not believe in climate change, but believes in your Black, low income, Latino, right? if you live in the floodplain, if you somebody has a high hazard profile, if you are uninsured, you low income, limited resources, it really believes in you, right? So this Baltimore Code Red project, they mapped out tree infrastructure, right? Looked at heat islands, and let me just say this real quickly: heat waves are hell for the poor and the elderly, right? What are we doing about that? So in this project, they really were able to visualize the differential climate impacts in the city of Baltimore. And I want to give a shout out real quick to my colleague, Dr. Lawrence Brown, the black butterfly. Segregation drives it. Racism drives it. Look at the wings of the butterfly, right? In Baltimore. Hyper segregate with black and brown folks, where the body of the butterfly has more racial mix and more higher income populations. You see higher heat levels in the wings compared to the body. You see more asthma cases in the wings compared to the body. You see lower home prices in the wings compared to the body. You see more food deserts in the wings compared to the body. You see more lead cases in the wings compared to the body. You see more gun violence in the wings compared to the body. You see lower life expectancy in the what? In the wings compared to the body. You see that patterning across many of our cities in the US because of structured racism, because of structured inequality. So our work is about dismantling those systems. An unjust system can't get you justice. So we work with communities on the front line, on the fence line, to make sure they have the science, the data to get action, to get change. I'll pass the mic.
Yes, so powerful and so grimly true. And that is, I mean, so when you talk about how our work relates to as the Chisholm Legacy Project, as you said, our tagline is a resource hub for Black frontline climate justice leadership. And it has been necessary, so necessary to have an organization to do this work because of what Jacoby and Latricia just described, because of the redlining and the disproportionate impact of climate change and the very pollutants that drive climate change on our communities. And so that's already been very well stated in terms of how we see those impacts. I also I also have been reflecting recently about how as I just held a retreat where we were coming together as a group of people who are caregivers, and they talked about the power of coming together, and talked about how so much of the communal nature, the communal culture of Black folks has been harmed by us being ripped away from our ancestral lands and so forth. And so even as we're herded together through redlining and so forth and kept out of certain spaces, as the saying goes, they tried to bury us, but they didn't know we were seeds. And that's exactly what we see when we see our communities coming together and developing projects like the projects that the projects that folks are leading here on the call and that folks are partnering with. And in Baltimore, the Community Land Trust partners project there, which is so powerful and amazing.
Mhm.
Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, just all the ways that our communities are coming together because we are such communal people, because we fully recognize that when spiders unite, we can tie up a lion. And so I appreciate the other side of the coin in terms of how we're so we have such a strong, resilient, where we shouldn't have to be resilient, but culture and nature to rise up against the oppression that this side has redlined us into to harm's way. So thank you.
Wow, I
Yeah.
love that. And it's really interesting how you referred to a lot of the organizations that are doing really good work in the community, but not necessarily leading with the climate change story. And it's because they don't need to.
Right.
Like building community, being a resource is resilience to climate change. And so we appreciate our partners who are doing that direct resourcing and deeply rooted in the community. So true. So moving on to the next question a little bit, I put in the chat for everyone on the call, all 94 participants, shout out to you all, a copy of the DHCD report on the impacts of redlining. And on page 9, you see another image of the black butterfly that Dr. Wilson was referring to. We saw it in my slides as well, but you can see it there too, because it really is, I mean, it's the poster child of redlining and how that continues to affect communities. But moving along a little bit, I mean, we might have to, of course, we're likely to talk about Baltimore some more, but what other areas in Maryland are seeing these connections between historical practices and current climate impacts? Or if we talk about Baltimore some more, I would love for you to zoom in a little bit on specific communities.
Yeah, I can jump in real quick. So, just to piggyback on Jackie's comment, and then the work of great work of Dr. Lawrence Brown, Professor Morgan State, Black Butterfly. One of the communities that's leading work in the EJ climate justice space is South Baltimore Community Trust, as Jackie mentioned. They were a group that emerged out of the Free Your Voice campaign. That was a group of high school students at Ben Franklin High School that organized to stop the energy incinerator from being built in their community. That community right now has about 70 facilities that are permitted under the Cleaner Act to pollute, right? So, when you think about a permit, it's in agencies that do that, it's pollution management. So you think about the constellation, the plumes of pollutants that people exposed to for particulate matter, to metals like lead, things that in the air that can cause asthma attacks, right? How those heat absorbing greenhouse gases, because you're having diesel being burnt, right? You have a coal fired power plant. You have a trash incinerator, Bresco. You have the country's largest medical waste incinerator, all in Curtis Bay. So you have the being dumped on, right? Being overburdened. You have classic oil and gas, fossil fuel infrastructure with coal-fired power plant. Then you have all these other peripheral industries that are dumping toxicants into the air, water, and soil, but also warming the climate. And then you think about in Curtis Bay with the concrete and asphalt and not as much tree canopy as folks need to have. You have the intersection of both chemical stressors, the pollutants, and also physical stressors like heat. So South Baltimore Community Land Trust is leading a fair development campaign where they're trying to bring in housing to folks to improve housing quality, but also fighting against the CXX coal exporter, right? Also fighting against the permitting of those thinning facilities, trying to get the cumulative impacts bill passed in the state of Maryland, which we call the Cherish Act, which is going to be about the seventh or eighth iteration since 2014 of us trying to pass a cumulative impacts bill in the state. So the lead group in our state, in my opinion, when it comes to EJ and climate justice, is South Baltimore Community Land Trust. When it comes to getting to solutions to, a lot of the lead groups are in Baltimore. And I'm gonna say this real quick. I won't talk too much. I'm gonna pass the mic. But solution that you see, and Jackie would chime in on this, of course, is about food. There's so many groups, the Land of Kush, you got the Baltimore, I think the Food Coalition, the Farmers Alliance. There are folks who are doing urban agriculture, regenerative agriculture, where they're providing food, right, but they're also bringing in greenscape, green infrastructure, bringing in trees, y'all, to deal with that heat mitigation and that air pollution mitigation. So yes, there's a lot of great work in Baltimore. Folks are not just problematizing, but they're also solutionizing and they're changing lives. I'll pass the mic.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. And a community member shared some information to say that the same things that are happening in Curtis Bay are happening in Cherry Hill as well. And I put in the chat the link for South Baltimore Community Land Trust if someone's on the call and they don't know about that organization. All right, anyone else want to chime in on that question?
Yeah, I can share. So interestingly enough, while historically Baltimore has been on the forefront around lead, particularly lead paint and housing, there's still a significant amount of housing stock in Baltimore, really highly concentrated all over. But like in Sandtown, Park Heights are some of the communities where you see extreme bouts of lead exposure. Also, as it relates to blight. So we know that along with a housing crisis, with the quality of housing, there is a significant blight issue. With that, when you juxtapose that with issues surrounding climate change, specifically around extreme weather, you see, or you can't see, but it's there, lead being literally strewn all throughout the community, whether it's with soil contamination, right? So with lead paint dust, it goes everywhere. When you look and see these blighted buildings, they're full of lead. In fact, what was this, back in 2018, maybe Dr. Wilson and I and some other folks were in a BET documentary talking about this lead paint crisis in Baltimore. Now, there are various laws and practices that exist around lead, but not to disparage our agencies, they're significantly under resourced and the accountability is sorely lacking. So I'll use an example. So the Baltimore City Health Department manages or releases a lead paint violation list. So Young, Gifted, and Green, since about 2017, has been doing an audit assessment of that report. We initially used the sample homes that we used to canvass with door knocking. They're literally properties that are on that list that date back to the early 2000s, that has still not been remedied. While, yes, it's great that we're identifying these properties, but where's the point of resolve, right? And so when we combine that with going door to door to some of these properties, either they're vacant, where there's no oversight at all, or there are people living in these homes on top of other environmental issues that are completely unaware that there's actually lead paint issues inside of the home. And the other thing that I will uplift that is a bit newer to Baltimore is around water infrastructure and water quality. There has been a significant rise in boil water notices that completely freaks out community, right? For a myriad of different reasons. On top of now, there is still an ongoing inventory around lead service lines in Baltimore. Now, again, Baltimore has been known for awareness around lead paint, but we do have to pay very close attention to water as well, not just for the sole purposes of lead in drinking water, but then also Baltimore is not, shy from PFAs and microplastics and other issues that are pervasive in water quality within the city as well. But the biggest thing is to understand how climate, this extreme wetting, the flash flooding exacerbates some of these public health issues that are largely due to inadequate and unsafe housing that exists throughout the city of Baltimore.
Hey, can I jump in real quick? Because I don't want to, you asked the question, not just focusing on Baltimore. So I want to make sure I highlight and elevate other communities that experience environmental climate issues in the state. So you come to Prince George's County, we have a lot of issues when it relates to food access and food deserts and food swamps. But really, when we talk about food apartheid, right? So poor food infrastructure in the county. We have places like Bladensburg, that's a lot of traffic and air pollution issues. You have historic neighborhoods like Eagle Harbor that's dealing with coal-fired power plant shutdown. They're being targeted for a data center, right? They have EJ issues. Look at stuff in Brandywine. They have EJ issues. They're unincorporated. So you have communities like Brandywine and Lothian that are unincorporated. So we call that contamination without representation. I was just in Nanjemoy last week in Charles County. Nanjemoy, y'all, historic Black community, got a beautiful watershed, beautiful deep in the country. You got folks who don't have access to publicly regulated sewer and water infrastructure. You got folks that are using porta potties to deal with their human waste because that sewage tank, the septic tanks have broken down. This is like stark EJ issues. So when we talk about environmental climate justice, not just in our urban areas, right? We got some stark EJ issues in our rural areas. And let me not forget my folks in Salisbury and the Eastern Shore of Maryland dealing with industrial chicken farms, right? So you think about the contributions of industrial animal agriculture to greenhouse gas emissions, but then those pollutants like particulate matter, like ammonia, where you can have runoff into the Chesapeake Bay, right? But Patapsco River, those impacts, but then the impacts on those host communities and also on those workers. And you come to the Patuxent, the only Black riverkeeper in the country, Fred Tubman, and the inputs of pollutants to Latrice's point, when you think about outflows from industry, that river has been impacted by a lot of pollution from industry. So we have the Anacostia River as well, and the folks who try to fish from the Anacostia. You got watermen who have been impacted by coastal flooding. So it's not just the urban heat island issues. You got flooding issues, as Latricia said, in Baltimore and other parts of the state. You got sewage backup issues in older housing stock and lead. So you think about chemical stressors, right? Air pollution, physical stresses, heat, and you got sewage backups, you got bacteria, y'all. So biological stressors too. So we got EJ in climate justice issues across the state of Maryland. You think about Harriet Tubman and that historic pathway to freedom for folks, and how that part of the state has been impacted by coastal flooding, some historic Black neighborhoods, right? So from flooding to heat to greenhouse gases to co-pollutants, right? We got the gamut in our state, and we got to think about these issues intersectionally, right? And making sure that we're looking at our most vulnerable when it comes to equity in climate change preparedness, response, recovery, mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. That's something that's needed in our state's climate action plan. That's needed from our agencies. That's needed from the legislature to make sure that the least of these, our most vulnerable, are prioritized when we're fighting for climate justice and we're fighting for environmental justice. I'll pass the mic.
Thank you. Wow. So yeah, I'll be super brief. First off, I just want to echo the shout out to Land of Kush because they actually catered our lunch today. We're having a convening here in Baltimore of the Just Transition Lawyers Institute, and they provided an amazing meal for us today. So, and it is representative of the bounty that exists in Baltimore and throughout the state of Maryland of leadership and of action. So some of the other Baltimore leader groups that I wanted to point out that that are doing work around food justice in particular, as well as tree canopy cover, as the Baltimore, I think it's the Baltimore Yield Institute that's doing this work on food. Yeah. And then there's also the Baltimore Tree. I forgot the full name of it, but it has tree in it. But that are doing work on canopy cover. Also, I wanted to, so the Chisholm Legacy Project, when we first started to do the work around community building and community support, what we did was we did a mapping of communities that are, oh yeah, the Baltimore Tree Trust is the name of it. Sorry. And also regionally, there's the beloved DMV Environmental Justice Collective that is tied to Interfaith Power and Light. And then of course there's the group that Shakobi has anchored, which is this kind of more informal but DMV EJ group that includes Maryland as well, and a lot of frontline groups there. But when we first started to map out communities that were in harm's way, whether we found them through EJ Screen, we used census data, we used other EPA data, and we had organizers that went out to communities to see, hey, what's going on here on paper. It looks like there might be some possible challenges, and we just really offered ourselves up to be able to support some of these communities. We actually wrote an article afterwards, in the midst of it, called "How Did You Find Us?" Because that was with some of these deeply rural communities, that was literally the first thing that people would say to our organizers: "How did you find us?" Which was both kind of gratifying in terms of us being in the place, finding places that felt unseen, but also heartbreaking that these communities felt invisibilized and unseen. Oh yes, Progressive Maryland. Thanks, Melissa. So some of the communities that we reached out to that are experiencing climate impacts, from flooding to water contamination. This is more of an EJ issue, but in a time with climate change where water is becoming scarce, then the contamination of what water we do have access to becomes all the more critical. So Pocomoke is Pocomoke City, Trap, West Denton, and Federalsburg are four of the communities that we have engaged with, that are interested in more work together. And so, as Jacoby said, whether it's the extreme heat or the flooding, these are challenges that these communities are facing more than ever. Particularly, I mean, this water infrastructure is something that we're finding consistently nationwide, in particularly former freedmen settlements or historically Black communities, where just something that's so basic in a world that's 2/3 water, where we're being deprived of this very basic resource. So those are a few things that we're observing in our work and here in Maryland. Thanks.
Oh, and can I jump in one more time, real quick? I mentioned data centers, and I'll just want to say this real quick. And I'll pass the mic to the moderator, to Brittany. I mentioned there's a data center fight in Eagle Harbor. Data centers, you have this legacy, oil and gas infrastructure, so legacy hazards, whether it be oil and gas, coal-fired power plants, gas-fired power plants, right? Incinerators. But data centers are emerging industrial hazard. So think about the strain on ratepayers, the strain on them talking about water quality, water pollution, and also the combustion byproducts when they burn gas and diesel for those facilities and the pollutants, the greenhouse gas emissions, but the co-pollutants that impact human health, like particulate matter. That's a big data center fight in Landover, Maryland, as well. So you think about what happened with the Renew Act. You also had the data center bill that was vetoed. And so how we're going to move forward to address climate change and climate injustice when we have an infrastructure that we see as being positive because of the economic benefits, right? But not doing a true cost assessment of what it means to our public health, what it means to our environmental safety, what it means for folks who are already struggling during the shutdown. You got a data center in your community, you're gonna be exposed to more air pollution, right? You're gonna be dealing with heat issues, you're gonna be dealing with light pollution. So what are we doing there? So we cannot be a lead on climate justice, climate change, environmental justice if we allow data centers just to run amok like it's a wild, wild west being unregulated in the state of Maryland. I'm gonna pass the mic.
Yes.
And actually, sorry, one more thing too. Sorry. So I mentioned we were at this retreat for caregivers over the weekend that we hosted, that we actually had to move it from one place to another. And I wanted to bring this up because so many of our historically Black communities, particularly on the Eastern Shore and Southern Maryland, are subject to what they call sunny day flooding, which is these increase in high tide. Someone from NOAA said that today's flood is going to be equal to tomorrow's high tide. So like high tides are such a normal thing, but they're getting higher and higher and actually becoming this chronic flooding situation. And our communities are being disproportionately impacted by that. So sorry about that. Just put that off that in.
No, fantastic. This conversation is robust. Even in the chat, there's so many good questions and so much conversation happening, questions and answers. A couple things I want to address, and then we'll move on to what can we do, because you can get a little bogged down and we don't want to land there. So one thing I wanted to address is I know all of us panelists are like trying to find the line, climate, environment. But that's the reality of the climate change situation. It is a threat multiplier. And so the environmental justice issues that we have been seeing in our communities for decades, now that climate change is here and affecting us in material ways in a way that it hasn't in the past, those things are multiplied. And so, especially for us Black and Brown people, we can't help but talk about both. So I'm just going to say, don't feel bad when you have to mention both right now on this call. And then I also wanted to say, Delegate Jamila Woods put a really good really good question in the chat, and also shout out Delegate McCaskill and Delegate Sheila Ruth. I see both of you here today, and I'll look at the participants again and see if I'm missing any other legislators. But the question was, well, how can we help people understand the urgency of the climate crisis? And I know moments like this, I feel, are what help people understand the urgency of the climate crisis. It's because climate change is too much of a buzzword. And fossil fuel interests have provided so much mis and disinformation, added so much confusion, added so much science into it, when it's not all that. I was just delighted, honestly, when I attended the Siege Symposium and Dr. Ballard spoke, and he said, you don't have to have a PhD to understand this. And as soon as we start enumerating the effects of the climate change, oh, Black and Brown communities are already fired up. They do care about their wealth attainment. They do care about flooding in their basement. They do care about their high energy bills. And so all you have to do is talk to it from the standpoint of impacts instead of trying to socialize the term climate change. But moving on, I would love for my panelists to start to address What can the state do to right these wrongs? And we have already shouted out lots of community groups, and they do important work as well. But tonight we do want to focus in a little bit on the state because we have all these people here, and they're excited to take action. So we want to tell them what actions to do to make our state to do something.
And
Yeah.
Brittany, I'm coming back on camera to get a close up view of these recommendations because as everyone knows, we're going into session. The Black Caucus actually has a retreat this Friday, so this is well timed where we'll be talking about our priorities for the 2026 session. And this has just been extremely enlightening and powerful to hear from these stewards and environmentalists. So I'm excited about this part where we talk about some of the state policy and how we can address this.
Happy to jump in. So before I say the state real quickly, Brittany, I do want to say that we do have a coalition called the Mid-Atlantic Justice Coalition. We have the Maryland State Table, which is one of the main EJ coalitions in the state of Maryland, advocating for bills, delegate to get passed in the legislature. So when it comes to the 2026 session, think about the Cherish Act. I talked about Cherish Act, cumulative impacts. One place for the delegates online to go to. I was co-chair of the Climate Environment Work Group for the governor's transition team. I helped to write the Climate Environment chapter. I'm looking at the transition plan right now. We have sections on environmental justice, short-term recommendations, and long-term actions. I want to read them out, but this is a really good resource for y'all to go to say, hey, let's look at what's in this as it relates to environmental justice. We have a whole section on heat in here as well. How do you deal with heat issues, urban heat islands? We talk about that, building codes, green roofs, green walls, painting the buildings, painting the rooftops white, treat green infrastructure, right? I mentioned food, right? I think food is the key. I'm about Booker T. Washington, y'all. How we can bring in self-sufficiency, but also bring in ecotopias, right, into our community. So vacant lots be transformed to food lots, to food forests. Bring in the school gardens, urban gardens, our mosques, our churches, growing food, bringing in green infrastructure, doing stormwater management, bringing in hydroponics in places that don't have a place to grow food like soil. You don't need soil. All you need is a building. Do it so and putting money into hydroponics, putting money to regenerative agriculture in our urban areas, addresses the food crisis, will help deal with stormwater issues, helps to put them in green infrastructure, deal with the heat crisis as well. I think that's a place to go. Also, again, delegate within this plan, there's discussion about how we address air quality. There's some long and short term actions that y'all can review as well in your retreat. And then there's additional items if you want to get into dealing with the Chesapeake Bay watershed, Inner Harbor in Baltimore, et cetera. So I have more to say. Well, I'm gonna go ahead and say it. Sorry, I'm gonna go ahead and take I'm gonna pass the mic. Let me pass the mic. So the climate action plan, I made a comment. So yeah, the state's climate action plan. So what are the equity metrics and indicators that we need to be tracking to make sure the climate action plan works for all Marylanders, for those that we know are disproportionately burdened because of the compounding vulnerabilities, right? Being uninsured, low income, living in a hazard zone, right? And also susceptibilities. We're talking about children who may be losing the parents may be losing the SNAP benefits and they can't eat, right? We're talking about elderly folks because the cutbacks, they may not have that medicine, Medicare, Medicaid cuts, right? What do we do to make sure those folks are prioritized? I think we need to have a bill that really connects those dots, right? And that we're prioritizing those residents in the state of Maryland. And there's a few more things I'll say, but I'm hogging the mic, so I'm gonna pass the mic.
Yeah, so I think, and I actually spoke about this earlier this week, there has to be some sort of accountability with the implications around public health. So we can have as many screening tools and research telling us what the issue is, but the bottom line is improved quality of life. I'll be honest, I'm tired of looking at the same thing over and over again about the disparities that exist in Black communities. How is life improving? So even with all of these dollars that were spent, I spent 4 years with the previous federal administration with making all of these recommendations about investments, But what is the return? The return shouldn't just solely be connected to economics. It needs to be connected to the well-being of Black folk, right? So we can do all of these innovations that talk about, a decrease in tonnage of CO2 and the like, but what happens to babies that have asthma, to the birth rates that exist, to infant mortality? Those things need to be tracked. There needs to be benchmarks around improvement from a public health perspective. So, along with understanding what the cumulative impacts are, do we see a decrease in that? And what are the implications from a public health perspective? Along with that, I think that there needs to absolutely be safeguards around no-go decision making that influences local politics. Far too often, you have like a South Baltimore land trust that is the bomb.com that rallies community, but then that hurts when you do all of this advocacy and then you still have people that go against the interests of community. There has to be some space where we truly have local power. When a community says no about wanting something in their backyard, it needs to be honored the same way that it is in white communities, like it is for Black communities. There still needs to be some sort of safeguard where we don't continue to see an overwhelming amount of pollution from industry being concentrated in the exact same communities. We're saying the same things in panels, but we're not seeing changes. We know that these legacy pollution issues are ending. Let's fix it. We know how to fix it, but we need our legislators and our policymakers to be brave, to stand up to industry. You might lose a little bit of coin, an investment on a campaign, but if you say that you're truly for the people, you have to reflect that in your policy, even if it makes you an enemy for corporate interests. We have to begin to prioritize people over profit, and that needs to show up better in policy. And then the last thing I will say is to the policymakers, respectfully, just because you get a bill passed doesn't mean it's going to be implemented with fidelity. You cannot walk away from that bill and say, my job is done. You can have the most innovative policies on the book, but if they're not being implemented with fidelity, if your agencies have incorporated some really undesirable rules around implementation, then it's counterproductive. So it's really important for policymakers to stay involved in the cyclical cycle, in a cycle of how policy is implemented. It's not stagnant, it keeps going. And so it's really important for our legislators to build more capacity to see how the actual bills they're introducing and getting passed, how they're being implemented on the ground.
Yeah.
Wow, it's hard to add anything at all to what's already been said. Such powerful words. The one thing I will say is thinking about ways that we actually institutionalize the very democracy that Latricia and Jacoby are calling for, the very people-led. How do we institutionalize the power of the people? And some of the measures that Maryland could really lead the nation in taking is getting serious about campaign finance reform and getting money out of politics so that we don't have polluters who are buying policies and politicians. Like, we really have to do that. We can lead on instituting universal basic income. Already during COVID, we saw, in some ways, a experiment with universal basic income. We were able to do it without breaking the bank, and study after study after study shows that when we institute universal basic income and guaranteed income, that people do better. People rise out of poverty, not just from that check that they get, but they actually are more likely to become gainfully employed if they get that leg up, because people are so disenfranchised. Looking at actually implementing ranked choice voting so that we actually don't have this kind of, false, just either one or the other, would be another step that Maryland could take. Like, if they really start to implement some of these really democracy institutionalizing policies, it could be a national leader, a global leader on what it looks like to actually have a democracy. So that's about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to jump back in on a few more things that are in play. So I think the Just Communities Act was mentioned in the chat, and it passed a few years ago. I think that's the best embodiment of Justice 40 at the state level in Maryland. And so making sure that Just Communities actually has funding, to Latrice's point, does it have funding to actually work? Because I think if you fund it, because Just Communities is going to highlight those communities that have been impacted by historic, contemporary, racial, economic, more housing segregation, right? But then you're basically getting a bucket of census tracts, or I think it's census tracts at the block group level, neighborhoods that could be captured. Then you can bring investments. So having your state agencies invest in those communities. Communities in Maryland who are experiencing environmental and climate injustice, they've had a disinvestment, right? So how can you make sure you don't have climate redlining? We talk about redlining, but we don't want climate redlining in Maryland. So you got to make sure things like Just Communities works for the people and is funded. You also have MDE's screening tool. Now, I always going to say that MDE screening tool is based off of our screening tool that we built at the University of Maryland. It was called Maryland EJ Screen. MDE's tool is called Maryland Viral Screen. But making sure that you're tracking all the dollars that come through our state, through the state, when it comes to addressing climate and environmental issues, and are we getting a return on investment on those dollars? Are the taxpayers, is their money going to improve their communities? How do we know, to Latricia's point again? That's something that needs to be done, that you actually have accountability baked into the system that makes those dollars are going where it's supposed to be going, and you're getting the impact, the return on investment, the climate resilience, the climate mitigation, the climate adaptation people are asking for. And another thing is voice. Voice is the executive order that the governor signed in back in, I think, in August. We should take voice and make it into a law. We know what happens when you have an EO at the federal level and a new president comes in. It can get rid of those EOs because they're not the law. So make voice a law. Part of voice is making sure the agencies in the state of Maryland are working together to address environmental justice. I think it's about 9 agencies, including the Department of Natural Resources, Department of Health, also, of course, MDE. I think also Maryland Energy Administration and a few others. So that's important. We got to make sure that we focus on clean energy in our state. So the fast track bill is problematic when we have an opportunity to build more gas-fired power plants. That needs to go. We got to make sure we don't follow Trump's playbook in fast tracking industry that can go in the same communities that are being dumped on. That's environmental injustice, and it's also environmental racism. We're not trying to expand environmental oppression and environmental slavery in the state of Maryland. We need to undo some of that fast tracking. So y'all should look into the fast tracking, right? And also, you think about reparations and environment. I use the term environmental slavery. I said it real quickly. You got folks who've been used over decades and decades to host these disamenities, to host hazards like coal-fired power plants, to host the port impacts, right? To host all these facilities, and they get none of the benefits. They internalize the impact. It impacts their genes. They impact developing fetuses in the bodies of mothers, right? That's real talk, y'all. So we think about reparations. We need a climate justice fund. So let's get some money. Yeah, we have a budget crisis in the state of Maryland, but with true cost accounting, think about all the lives that we're losing, all the money that's being lost because of the social safety nets, the health safety nets, and the economic safety nets, right? You save money, you save lives, and you create opportunity when you make sure you advance environmental climate justice. So create a climate justice fund, and I will pass the mic.
That's fantastic, everyone. Thank you for all of the suggestions about things the state can do, things that legislators can think about, and things that all of the organizations on here can choose to support, and residents as well. We're going to pivot a little bit to the call to action to give people a moment to advocate. And after the call to action, we'll go back to all of the panelists for some closing remarks. So really quickly, I'm putting in the chat an email where you can click the link and email your legislators to let them know that you think that the overrides of the Renew Act and the Reparations Commission should both happen when session comes back. And while you're filling this out, we're going to explain both of the pieces of legislation. So I'm going to start with Chair Wilkins to explain the Reparations Commission, because I want to be very clear for everyone. These bills are not interchangeable. These ideas cannot replace one another. Reparations Commission is about catching our communities up. And then on top of that, we'll add the Renew Act. So we'll go ahead and go to Chair Wilkins.
Thank you so much. I think it's really important that we unpack these two pieces of legislation that the Legislative Black Caucus of Maryland supported this year. One being the Renew Act, which most people on the call are familiar with, which is about really making sure that polluters pay the price for climate action and all of the issues that we have been talking about here. We want to make sure that those who are causing the harm are also paying the price for that. And that could fund certain things like the Climate Action Fund that Dr. Wilson included. And we also made sure that in the legislation, the Black Caucus championed making sure that those funds go to the most impacted communities. That was a piece that we played a really instrumental role in. In addition to that, the Black Caucus knows and understands deeply that all of the issues that we talked about, whether it's redlining, whether it's issues dealing with health disparities, these all come from systemic issues and historic policies that have taken place in our state. We need a comprehensive plan, not just a piecemeal here bill, a piecemeal there bill, but a comprehensive plan done by a commission in order to talk about climate change and environmental justice, to talk about racial wealth disparities, to talk about the health disparities and these issues and how we fix those harms systemically. The Maryland Reparations Commission is a comprehensive commission that seats our experts across the state to come up with a plan for reparations. And while these are two different issues, these are not interchangeable. There are two issues with a lot at stake for Black communities and that bring together the environmental community as well as individuals who may not have been environmental advocates, but are interested in issues that deal with justice for Black Marylanders. So this conversation is so important for us to build coalition, number one, and number two, to make sure that when we talk about reparations, that environmental justice is a part of that. That when this commission comes together, one of the recommendations can be that we need a climate justice fund and also recommendations on how we appropriate funds in order to do something like that. So the Maryland Reparations Commission is a piece of legislation that's absolutely critical. We need our communities that are interested in the environment to also be interested in Black justice issues such as a reparations commission and the agenda of the Legislative Black Caucus of Maryland more broadly. And by the same token, as we advocate for a reparations commission, that environmental justice is a part of that conversation. So that's why it was so important on these two bills that the Black Caucus has prioritized to have this conversation, to come together, to build coalition, to explain the two bills and ask for your support on both. Because if we come together, we will be able to bring these bills to fruition and override that veto. So that is certainly the call to action for us, that we are at the table on both issues, that we come together and that we understand how systemically these issues have truly impacted our communities and how we won't be able to see change unless we move forward together. And someone put green reparations. I like that. Yes, green reparations. We are definitely going to use that. I love it. So I'll pause there.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you for that fantastic summary. Uh, Again, in the chat, there's the link to email your legislators. And even though at the heading it says Renew Act, but when you read the body, it is expressing the commitment to both veto overrides, because just as Chair Wickens stated, we are expressing our solidarity. So I'll kick it back to my panelists for final words. How would you like to wrap up this conversation? What would you like people to leave with?
Brittany, I'll start off very quickly by just thanking our experts here. I am so grateful for this conversation. I have learned so much. I have pages of notes here, and I just want to thank our Black environmentalists. The work that you are doing is so critical, and I really hope to just build on our partnerships so that you can lead us and guide us as a Black caucus. And finally, I did have some colleagues on the line who I want to make sure I mention. Delegate Robin Lewis, Delegate Sheila Ruth, and Delegate Jamila Woods, who is the Secretary of the Legislative Black Caucus of Maryland, and Delegate Alethea McCaskill, who is the House sponsor of the Maryland Reparations Commission. Thank you all for joining and for your leadership and service in Maryland.
I can go briefly, but I guess like my closing thing that I will say is even though it is very chaotic on the Hill in DC, we have a lot of power at the state and local level. If this administration is saying that they want to give power back to the state, what a powerful state and a good position the state of Maryland is. Listen, I'm from the state of Tennessee. Tennessee ain't Maryland. So there's a lot of opportunity for our Black legislators to truly be a model for other state legislatures throughout the country on how to truly get this right, and really just staying optimistic and not relinquishing our power. And then the last thing I will say, now more than ever, and I'm grateful for our legislators, is to be brave. I'm going to lean into our great ancestor, Shirley Chisholm. Be unbought, right? Be unbossed,
Mm.
unapologetic, and not bought, right? Unbought is really important and critical more than ever that we, again, I'm gonna keep reiterating this, that we have to prioritize people over profit. We have to. And trust, it was the millennials, but we got Gen Z and they are major resources and researchers. They will really literally track like where those dollars are to ensure that even with our legislators, that their interactions with funders actually is a good reflection of what should go into the community. And there's not any type of corroboration with industry that actually is harming the very constituents that our legislators should be serving. So thank you for this opportunity. And I'm also looking forward to continued partnership.
I am going to jump in so that Dr. Wilson can have the last word. So, yeah, I just want to underscore the really what Latricia said is that when we're in the situation of an authoritarian regime at the federal level, the states become all the more important. And Chair Wilkins and the folks that she named, the fact that you're all on this call means that you're the folks that we need in those seats, and we need to make sure that we're not able to kind of name on one hand the people who are riding for what we need. In our community. So we really have to make sure that Maryland has the policies that enable true democracy, that enable us to be able to get the people in office who are unbought and unbossed. And that so we have to pass campaign finance reform. We have to lean into ranked choice voting. We have to put these policies in place that enable us to truly have so that our votes actually do matter, and that we have people who are representing our interests who are making these decisions. So, and thank you to Chair Wilkins and the others who are on the call for being with us in community and in joint action. So thank you. Passing the mic.
Yeah, thank you. I'll take the mic. It's been really heartening to be on this panel with my colleagues who I know really well. So it's been great. And to see Chair Wilkins and your colleagues on this call, I think is great, as everyone has already said, to build that beloved community, right? We it takes that work, right? We got to work together. So I would say Siege Inc. is happy, looking forward to working with the Legislative Black Caucus and as a partner to some of the things I talked about. I know I went through it real quickly, and of course that transition plan. Really want to see the governor's transition plan. If y'all can take that and move it forward. I mean, so much in there that people worked hard. We got a lot of feedback from Marylanders in that transition plan. It's not just there's transportation things, there's energy, there's housing. There's so much there. And it was an all hands approach that was talked about, right, with the transition plan. So I think that's a great document that could be leveraged and researched and figure out how you can make it work for all Marylanders, but particularly those who are living in sacrifice zones, who are being dumped on, right? And as we said, we want to make sure the community groups that are the front line, fence line, are able to talk to you, knock on your doors, that you can hear from those constituents who are struggling, and particularly those who've been impacted by the shutdown, right? You saw what happened across the country last night with the vote. Democracy is still alive and well, y'all. It's alive and well. It's not gone. People are getting this democracy back on track. How can we work together to get the democracy back on track in the state of Maryland? How can we work together to make sure the folks who've been hit by the shutdown, we know we have more federal agencies in our state than any other state, right? Those workers who've been furloughed, who've been riffed, who've lost their jobs, their families are suffering right now. How can we support them? How can we build forward better together? That was a theme of a symposium that Brittany mentioned. How can we do that together in Maryland with all of our groups, frontline, fence line groups, our advocates, our legislators, our agencies? I think we need that type of leadership right now. And it's really hard to be on this call, and really happy to see, this discussion, and looking forward to make sure we can get to not just reparative justice, but restorative justice, right? Intergenerational justice and distributional justice, making sure that those who are at the frontline communities are at the front of the line when it comes to these positive impacts we're trying to see when it comes to climate mitigation, adaptation, and building resilient communities. So I'll pass the mic to Brittany. Thank you.
No, I don't have anything to add. You all are so fantastic. So I'll just pass it back to Chair Wilkins for the final goodbye.
I want to once again express my gratitude to this amazing group that has been assembled. We really have to elevate the issue of environmental justice and particularly Black leadership when it comes to climate issues. And this has just been amazing for me to listen to as a legislator and hear all of the organizations and all of the work, because sometimes we can be sort of in our own corners getting this work done. So for us to come together around environmental issues, to come together around restorative practices and issues dealing with repairing past harm has been very powerful. So thank you, Brittany, for all of your work helping to put this together and your partnership with CCAN. Brittany is a resident of District 20. Great things come from District 20, my district. And so we have a lot of work to do. And in coalition, we are most powerful. So I'm excited to come together to override these two vetoes, the Maryland Reparations Commission and the Renew Act. Those are definitely two marching orders for us in the next session, the next time the legislature convenes. So asking everyone to go out to your legislators, tell them you want these two bills done, and go ahead and add in something that you learned in this conversation and something that you want to see happen in Maryland. So thank you again for your time. Thank you for your partnership, and I'm looking forward to our work together ahead.
Thank you.